Welkom allemaal. Fijn dat jullie meekijken naar Take Back the Street. Een samenwerking tussen Arminius en Lidewij. Het is misschien een beetje vreemd om te zeggen Take Back the Street. Want wanneer je iets wilt terugnemen, moet het in eerste instantie überhaupt ooit van jou zijn geweest. En dat is in deze context nog maar de vraag. Desondanks is het onderwerp waar we het vandaag over gaan hebben ontzettend belangrijk. Voor het heden, maar zeker ook voor de toekomst. Mijn naam is Hasna El-Maroudi en ik ben vandaag de moderator. We gaan het hebben over veiligheid en daaraan gekoppeld de inrichting van de publieke ruimte. Veel mensen voelen zich of zijn tot op de dag van vandaag onveilig op straat. Voor Lidewij schreef ik vorig jaar een artikel waarin ik ook opriep aan de lezers om mij hun ervaringen toe te sturen van wat zij doen om zich veiliger te voelen op straat. Laten we daar even naar luisteren, want dat waren ontzettend veel reacties.
Ik neem liever de fiets dan dat ik loop, dan ben ik sneller.
Ik kijk overdreven boos, ook wanneer ik dat niet ben.
Ik doe mijn haar vast om minder vrouwelijk over te komen.
Ik neem de lange route naar huis om niet langs onveilige plekken te hoeven.
Ik doe mijn oordopjes in, maar zonder muziek aan, zodat ik alles goed kan horen.
Ik neem een trui mee, ook als het warm is, om 's avonds aan te kunnen trekken.
Ik wissel van stoep als ik iemand tegemoet loop.
Ik bel met een vriendin of doe alsof als ik me onveilig voel.
Ik vermijd oogcontact.
Ik probeer extra rechtop te lopen om zelfverzekerd over te komen.
Ik bel met een vriendin
of doe alsof als ik me onveilig voel.
Ik hou mijn sleutels vast als wapen.
Ik vermijd oogcontact.
Ik controleer of de batterij van mijn telefoon opgeladen genoeg is.
Ik hou mijn sleutels vast als wapen.
Ik check vlak voor ik mijn huis in ga of er niemand in de buurt is.
Ik ga nooit alleen op de fiets naar huis.
Zoals ik al zei, kreeg ontzettend veel reacties per mail met hele lappen tekst waarin men uit de doeken deed wat zij doen om zich maar veiliger te voelen. En al die reacties waren even herkenbaar. Dus dat zette ons bij Lilith aan het denken over de veiligheid op straat en wat we daar nou aan kunnen doen om dat te verbeteren. Nou, over die veiligheid wordt al jaren gesproken en er wordt ook al jaren ingegrepen. De politiek bedenkt van alles en nog wat. Maar dat is vaak repressief en het gaat vaak alleen over vrouwen. Want lange tijd werden de behoeften van queer mensen, van transpersonen, van mensen met een beperking voor het gemak eventjes achterwege gelaten. We hebben nu besloten om een reeks talks te ontwikkelen waarin we met elkaar in gesprek gaan met de deskundigen, met ervaringsdeskundigen, met de politici zelf, met activisten over wat we nou kunnen doen om die publieke ruimte toegankelijker en veiliger te maken voor iedereen en dan ook daadwerkelijk iedereen. Vandaag in mijn Rotterdam deel 1 van Take Back the Streets. We hebben een heel vol programma. Een aantal van de panelleden zitten hier al bij me. Maar in het eerste deel ga ik in gesprek met Leslie Kern. Zij is auteur van het boek Feminist City, Reclaiming Space in a Man-Made World. Dat deel zal in het Engels zijn, het panelgesprek zal in het Nederlands zijn. Tussendoor hebben we nog een heel erg mooi intermezzo van Pelumi Adejumo. Uiteraard is er ook ruimte voor de kijkers en de luisteraars. Heb je vragen, stel ze dan vooral. Dan zit Gitka hier, die neemt de vragen mee en dan kunnen we deze ook stellen. Sowieso na het eerste deel met Leslie, maar uiteraard ook straks in het gedeelte met de panelleden. Maar nu eerst is het toch echt tijd voor het interview. Leslie Kern is a feminist urban geographer. Her research revolves around gender in cities, gentrification and environmental justice. As said, she is the author of Feminist City, an exploration of the gendered urban world we live in, published in July 2020 by Verso Books. Welcome, Leslie. It's so wonderful that you could be here today with us. How are you? Let's start off with that.
I'm very well. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to join you this morning.
It's actually the second time that we get to talk about your book as well, and because it's such an important topic. But for those that don't know the book or don't know your work, maybe you can explain a little bit about what your book is about and why you decided that you should write this book.
Sure. Well, in my day job, as you mentioned, I'm a university professor and an academic researcher. So I get to talk about these kinds of questions all the time with my students and to academic peers. But I wanted to write something that would be more accessible and engaging to a wider audience of people, so that some of the ideas that I now kind of take for granted about how urban space works, its gendered nature, how power flows through spaces, could really be taken up and understood by everyday people as they move through the city, and might occasionally wonder to themselves, why is this building structured in this way? Why are there no bathrooms for me? Or why is it so hard to get my stroller onto the bus?
Ah, that's so good. And what sparked the idea? Because was it from sparked by your profession, or was it the conversations you had with your peers?
Well, I think there's a really great moment all around the world right now for feminist writing about all sorts of political, personal, social, health, and economic issues. And I was thinking, what could I possibly contribute to this conversation? And I thought, oh, cities, that's something I know about. I could offer that little piece of the puzzle to our broader sort of feminist analysis of everything that's happening in the world.
Yeah, and if we speak about a feminist city, what does a feminist city look like?
Well, certainly over the course of the last year with the pandemic, I've had a lot of time to really consider and reconsider and crystallize some of my ideas about this. And one of the things that keeps rising to the forefront for me is that a feminist city has to be one where care work is really valued and supported and taken seriously, considered not as an afterthought, not as something that we design for and think about after we've met the needs of this thing called the economy, but that it's at the front of thinking about planning and design, because I think many of us have recognized that care work is really what keeps the world running during a time of crisis, but our cities have not really been set up to prioritize it.
Mm-hmm. And in what way do you see that that is not prioritized? Like, what specific things within urban planning can you pinpoint?
Sure. So if we were to think about public transportation systems or our roads and freeways, they're very much designed to get a commuter subject from home to work and back in a linear fashion, not making a lot of other stops along the way. But for most women who are still primarily responsible for much care work in our society, their journeys through the city are much more complicated and less linear. They're stopping to drop off children. They go to their paid job. On the way home, they're picking up diapers or something for dinner. They're collecting children again. They're checking on elderly parents. They're looking in on a neighbor. And the transportation systems, the mobility systems that we have around the city can make this quite difficult to do in an efficient way and an affordable way. And it really adds an extra burden onto care labor. So that's just one area where we could think about, could we redesign our infrastructure in ways that would support all of the people who might be doing that labor.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the cities or the urban spaces right now, for whom would you say are cities built?
Well, I think there's a kind of implicit typical urban subject in mind, which is that of a working age man, an able-bodied man, a heterosexual man who is the breadwinner for the family. Even though this is perhaps not even the typical male experience these days, there's still a kind of outdated assumption about what a sort of normal family is like, who's doing what types of labor and where that labor is happening. And so what has ended up being prioritized is the needs, or at least the needs of a man from 50 years ago in his commute, in his lifestyle, in the things that he needs to accomplish the role that he's been assigned in society.
Yeah. So today we're coming together to talk about also about violence and street harassment and the way city planning can also maybe help prevent that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, it's certainly a complicated issue, and I like to think that if we had figured out a way to just design out street harassment, that we would have already done it. So we definitely need a combination of social change as well as physical and environmental change. But certainly the kinds of areas of the city where women experience and fear harassment tend to be ones where there are less people on the streets, where there's a feeling of vulnerability and isolation, and planning can help with those things. Sometimes it's as simple as lighting or as having more pedestrian or foot traffic go through an area. But I think there also has to be an attitudinal change on the part of people to stop seeing it as just a normal experience that people have to accept, and for bystanders to speak up when they hear or see harassment happening, to let everyone know it's not socially acceptable anymore to treat people this way.
Yeah. So it's much broader. Is there any explanation for why this is still happening and why there are still places within city development where there's not enough lighting, or where the sidewalks aren't wide enough for people to be able to keep their distance?
It's a good question. Again, so much of it comes down to the things that we've prioritized in our cities. Certainly in North American cities, car traffic has been highly prioritized over pedestrian traffic. And this is actually a gendered issue. Men take more car trips than women, and women take more pedestrian and public transit trips than men. So when you've shrunk the sidewalk space, or made it less accessible, or not devoted money to the infrastructure and upkeep of pedestrian spaces, then you're actually disadvantaging women in those circumstances. So we can think about very basic things like sidewalk maintenance, clearing the snow from sidewalks, having safe ways to cross the street, and so on, as part of a feminist city.
Yeah. And how has your book been received by the people in the field as well? Because to me, it really opened my eyes to this idea that society has been focused mainly on men and their needs, and we need to actually look at it from a different perspective. Do you feel that your that the people you work with also had this I would almost say this blind spot, that they didn't see what needed to be done?
Yeah, I've definitely been invited to have talks and conversations with people in planning and urban design and architecture. And I think the message has been well received, particularly by a younger generation of people who are questioning, why aren't we taught about this in architecture school? Why isn't a feminist perspective or accessibility issues or racial justice issues brought up as part of our curriculum? And for me, it's a little bit surprising, because I'm not the first person to talk about these. In fact, my book I think of as almost a summary of work that's been done over many decades by feminists and others who have tried to broaden the conversation about who needs to be included in planning and architecture. So it's a little surprising that for some people it's the first time they're hearing it, but if it's hopefully not the last time, then that's a win. But I think part of it is that we all have, in cultural norms, inherited ways of understanding and thinking about the world that we're not always encouraged to question. So when I say to people, have we thought about how the public-private divide maintains kind of an exploitative care work relationship across gender? And people go, oh yeah, we're taking for granted a lot of things about what should be private and what should be public. Mm-hmm. So it's about shaking up some of those common sense assumptions. And so far people have been quite open to at least hearing it. Whether it generates change is a longer term question.
Yeah. I spoke to the alderman Wijminga here in Rotterdam before this talk, actually. And when I asked him who was, whether women were also co-working with city planning, and if they were how do I say that? If they got to join as well. And he had this little pause, and then he was like, oh yeah, no, I don't know. I'm not sure actually, but that's a good point. So I think making spaces inclusive in all different levels is very important. What came up, or what would you say would be the most prioritized change that needs to happen when it comes to city development to make it more inclusive for everyone? Can you think of anything that needs to be done right now?
Well, again, thinking about the pandemic, one of the things that I think we really need to be reconsidering, is this organization of care labor and the way that it has been disproportionately placed on women's shoulders for so long, to the extent that when we are in a health crisis, which is really a care crisis, we've seen women losing their jobs by the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions around the world. We've seen women unable to juggle the burden of all of the domestic work they do, plus their paid labor. We've seen women on the front lines of the essential work that's being done in hospitals and schools and long-term care homes, being exposed to illness, bringing it home to their families, being stressed and burnt out. And it's a real reminder, I think, that again, we haven't really valued this kind of labor. We haven't thought about, can we organize our cities in ways so that this is collective and shared labor, so that we pay it well when people do it for money, and so that we don't assume that all of this labor can just happen in the private space of the home. So this requires rethinking everything from how we use our public spaces. What can they be used for? Can we imagine them as spaces of care work? To rethinking the home and maybe realizing that the single family home, the nuclear family, is not the ideal situation for everyone. And we need a broader range of options that would allow us to share this vital care labor that we should all be taking part in and valuing in society.
Yeah. Do you have any idea why care labor has been always taken for granted and assumed to just be there?
Well, I think it's absolutely vital that this labor happens in order to prop up a capitalist economic system, right? We wouldn't be able to have the kind of economy that we have without a sort of exploited free labor happening in the home to do all of the work that creates workers for capitalism, or cares for them, raises them, feeds them, cleans them, educates them, and so on. So the system as we know it would kind of be radically shaken up if we organized care labor in a different way. So the why is kind of that it supports the status quo very well, and people benefit from it, those who are in power, who have economic power. So there's resistance to change because it's hard to even imagine what a world would look like where we didn't have that kind of division of labor.
Yeah, and if we would, are there any examples of more inclusive spaces, whether it is cities or more rural areas, that we can look to also for answers?
Sure. Well, many cities, particularly in Europe, have taken on a gender mainstreaming approach, which is where when it comes to any sort of new development, whether it's housing or transportation or schools or green spaces, they ask whether this would increase gender equity or not. And there's an active sense that gender equity can be increased through good planning decisions. And what this can end up looking like is a greater integration of spaces of home and work, leisure, school, healthcare, and so on, because when those things are separated out, when residential areas are far from business and work areas or from school and healthcare areas, this creates this extra time burden of care labor. But when these things are integrated, some people call it, the 15-minute city or the 20-minute city, the idea that these things could be in close proximity to home, it actually really supports that care labor. Now, I would say we have to go a bit further because we don't want to just say, well, let's just make it easier for women to keep doing all of this work. We want to find ways to spread this work around so that it's shared both between men and women, but also shared more broadly in society, that it's not just seen as something that the private family has to take care of. So that requires building in more spaces for childcare in cities. It requires maybe, again, reimagining, can we use urban public spaces as spaces where we collectively cook and feed people, or where education happens, such that we're not overburdening the nuclear family with all of this work.
Yeah, thank you. Before we round up this part of the conversation, Gitka, are there any questions from the audience?
Well, it's a bit quiet in the chat at the moment, so I thought let's let's take a chance for my question to be asked. I was wondering, Leslie, do you have an anecdote based on a personal experience when you thought, okay, so the city is actually not built for my needs?
Could you hear that right? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, thank you. Probably the first time that this really came rushing home to me was when I was pregnant and then had my daughter when she was a baby, and I was living in London in the UK at the time. And I had always loved city life. I loved traveling all over the city. I felt very free and independent. And all of a sudden, when I had a stroller or a baby attached to me, it felt like the city was out to get me. I could no longer get on the bus with relative ease. I felt that I was in people's way. People wanted to speak to me and give me advice all of the time about the baby. I could no longer be that anonymous, independent, sort of, invisible flâneuse in the city. It really brought home to me that once you are a mom or part of this family unit, you're not really expected to be out in public life in the same way. So everything from trying to find a bathroom where you could change a baby, to just being able to access public transportation, to just moving down a crowded sidewalk and a busy street made me feel very out of place, and started to raise for me these questions of, are cities welcoming to women? Are they built for women? And in what ways are we continuing to be excluded even in the 21st century?
That's so recognizable. I remember when I had my daughter and my husband would take her out, I don't know, to the zoo or whatever. And then he would come home. We lived really near by the zoo, to change her diaper, because there was no place for him to change the diaper at the zoo. So yes, it does spark the idea of who is supposed to do what, and for who is, how accessible is everything for who is it made? Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
I have my panelists here with me, whom I will all introduce later on, but maybe one of you has a question or a remark for Leslie. Blank stares. Lidewij, I see you.
Many questions, but first, thank you very much, Leslie, for your book, because I think it's really important that we keep telling this story, and also keep reminding people how much knowledge has been developed already in the past decades, as you said. And unfortunately, many professional planners still don't know about this. And if they know about it, they don't know how to use it in their everyday professional practice. I think it's a great help.
Thank you. That's a great point. I think a lot of planners and architects are very open to this, but they are also constrained by budgets, by city rules and regulations, by the desires of corporate developers and so on. They don't have total freedom to do everything that they would want to, but hopefully they can push for at least small changes in the short term.
So, Gitka, there is a question now from...
Yeah, actually a couple of ones. I think there are a couple of designers looking at as well. Because, for example, I have a question here, Leslie, for you. Would you have any clues if there's a way to enhance the female friendliness of cities through small interventions that could be included in design processes? And another question as well, somebody is wondering, is there a city that comes close to being as inclusive as possible?
Great questions. For the first question, I think there are some relatively small, easy, and not incredibly expensive things that cities could do. One of them would be around public toilets. So in many cities, there's an overall lack of public toilets, or they're much more available to men than to women. And certainly they are often not available at all to trans or non-binary people. So increasing the provision of safe and clean public restrooms allows people to have greater access to the public realm. And it's really important right now in this pandemic, when we've been told, let's get outside, let's use our public spaces more, it's safer to be outdoors. But if there's nowhere to go to the bathroom or to change a baby or to look after an elderly person's needs, then you can't really be out in public. we can also take symbolic measures, like can we rename some streets in the city, or new streets could be given the names of important women in history or in culture? Can we rename our public spaces or tell different stories about them? These are symbolic, but I think they communicate a message about who belongs, whose stories are important, and who we value in space. As for cities that come close, it's hard to say. I think there's little, aspects of things in different cities that I've noticed. Like if I go to Copenhagen, for example, or other places where there's tons of cycling and there's a big cycling infrastructure, and you see that it's not just commuters, but it's whole families cycling. This to me indicates a city that kind of values a different way of organizing the economy, that hasn't over-prioritized cars, that sees mobility for the whole family as an important feature, and that is dedicated to making that safe for as many people as possible. In North America, we're quite terrible at this, and many of our bike infrastructure is still very scary and frightening, especially for women who experience harassment and feel unsafe next to our sort of 8 lanes of cars and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Leslie, for taking the time out to talk to us today. Leslie is the author of the book Feminist City, Reclaiming Space in a Man-Made World.
Thank you, everyone.
Dan gaan we nu door naar het deel in het Nederlands. Voordat ik mijn panel ga introduceren, gaan we eerst naar de intermezzo. We gaan luisteren naar Pelumi Adejumo. Pelumi schrijft, fotografeert en zingt. Ze studeert creative writing aan Artes. En ze werd begin 2020 door NRC Handelsblad geselecteerd als een van de 101 veelbelovende kunstenaars in de lage landen. Pelumi, the floor is yours. Gaan we even hier met z'n allen nog voor de klappen, want dat kan nu met 5 mensen hier op een rij.
Take me outside. Sit in the green garden. Nobody out there, but it's okay now. Bathe in the moonlight. Don't mind if rain falls. Take me outside. To the green garden, then I'll fly on the wings of a butterfly, high as a tree top and down again, putting my back down, taking my shoes off, walking the carpet of green velvet. Dance in my garden like we used to. Dance in my garden like we used to. Take me outside, sit in the green garden. Nobody out there, but it's okay now. Bathe in the moonlight, don't mind if rain falls. Take me outside to the green garden, and I'll fly on the wings of a butterfly, high as a tree top and down again, putting my back down, taking my shoes off, walking the carpet of green velvet. Dance in my garden like we used to. Dance in my garden like we used to. I'll go wherever you go, wherever you take me, I'll go wherever you Het is nog nooit zo veilig geweest. Je vindt portretten van zedenmisdadigers bij de ingang van elk appartementencomplex. Eng en mysterieus vinden wij. Meisjeslichamen. Wanneer er een lichaam gevonden wordt tussen de houtsnippers, aangedaan, bloot, worden daar foto's van gedeeld op het 6 uur journaal en geprint in het nieuwsblad. Volle scherpte zonder waarschuwing. In een rij van meisjeslichamen oefenen wij onze vrije wil. Proberen we naar de foto's te kijken zonder weg te schromen. Stellen we ons voor, wat betekent het om? Vragen we ons af, kan aanranding ook op afstand? Meisjes jaren later in een herinnering of inzicht bij het grof vuil waar je tegenaan loopt naast de lift. Je hoort de vrouw erover in hun remslaap. De hordes van Sista Mary's oom. Voor iedere opgestapte geit, kei een stokslag. Zulke vrouwen krijgen een naam. Je herkent ze aan de krakende kaken. Sista niet paf paf, Sista kei. En de bedplassers krijgen een lijflied. En wij meisjes, wij dansen zo. Tale tale ogoridi. Eigenlijk alleen op bekende plekken. Op het erf, in de schuur, op de bank bij. Op de stoep voor de deur van het huis van. Voor de webcam in de slaapkamer. In het huis van je ouders. In het huis van je ouders. Dank je.
Dat was Pelumi Adejumo. Dankjewel, Pelumi. Ik krijg een kippenvel ervan, een soort brokje in mijn buik. En van het eerste a cappella gedeelte tegelijkertijd op een hele vreemde manier ook zin om in de tuin te gaan dansen nu de zon buiten weer schijnt en de lente echt begonnen is.